I will talk about my PhD, but I'm actually going to set it in kind of what's already being done out there, but also what we know from the media, because animal-assisted interventions are something that we've all heard about and we've all read about in the media, but what's the science behind it? So I'll start off by kind of presenting some of the knowledge in the media currently, what kind of the media tells us we know about animal-assisted interventions, and then the actual research, so the scientific research behind it, as well as the theory and the limitations around that as well. And then I will outline my PhD, which was quite a large project. It was longitudinal, and it was attempting to overcome some of the methodological issues around animal-assisted interventions. And then I'll finish off with some findings and some conclusions from the research that I conducted. So what does the media say about animal-assisted interventions? Well, I've picked out a few different stories from different media outlets just to kind of present the majority of what's being written. So therapy dogs were introduced into an airport to help nervous flyers. And within this article, there are the typical kind of opinion-based things that we say, like dogs are well known for boosting general happiness, well-being, they make us feel better, they improve our mood. The issue here is really that we don't really know how much dogs help, particularly in that setting, particularly in an airport and with nervous flyers. And actually, it's not likely to help everyone. And also, these dogs in particular were visiting twice a week. So then there's an argument for if they are really, really effective, then why are we only having 2 visits a week? But the reality is we don't actually know how effective dogs are in reducing anxiety. Then there is another study which looked at the fact that dogs have a magic effect and how pets can improve our mental health. Some of you might have come to a discussion that we had in Welcome Week, and this was one of the articles we discussed. This has the idea that pets love us unconditionally and that they don't judge us, so this idea kind of social support. But interestingly, within this study, somebody talks about how much their dog has helped them, but actually they had a lot of other changes happening in their life. So they got a better job, their family circumstances changed, so they went to therapy. So actually all of those things changed, but they kind of said it's the dog that made the difference. And the idea that dogs have this kind of magic pill is something that we need to be careful about, because it's lots of different factors that actually have an impact. And the other thing within this article is actually that they somehow at the end conclude that it's all down to oxytocin. Now, the reality is we have no research to suggest really, or not enough research to suggest that oxytocin has a role to play within this. And so we shouldn't really be making such conclusions without having the research behind it. A lot of researchers have suggested that there may be a link between oxytocin, because we do have research around cortisol as well. But actually we haven't got the science to back this up. Science says your pet is good for your mental health. Again, this actually talks about animals in clinical settings and to combat loneliness and anxiety. But the article itself says that there's not enough conclusive research, because often research finds benefits, but some research doesn't. So why is it then that if we know that there is this kind of lack of clarity around the findings, why is it that we still go ahead and actually we still say, well, it's okay because animals still help, so we should still have animal-assisted interventions everywhere? It seems that the animal-assisted interventions have kind of gone ahead of the science, and we wouldn't really think about rolling out any other intervention that we don't have significant findings for and that we don't know the mechanisms of change for. Yet with animal-assisted interventions, we tend to be doing it. Then there is a story around my pet helped me so much during the pandemic. And this is a mixture really, because some of the stories within this actually talk about assistance dogs, and they are completely different to therapy dogs or pets because they're so well trained and they have so many purposes and such a job to do as well. But we really need to be careful with titles like this, because actually over the lockdown, we've seen an increase of 30% of pet ownership. And this is really problematic because it's actually encouraging poor breeding practices. So the animal welfare is likely to be compromised, but also we need to think about the long term. So we're still living in this kind of COVID life where we're at home a lot and our dogs or puppies have us with them all the time. But what's going to happen in 2 years' time when people go back to work? So if you've got a puppy in lockdown and it's 2 years old before you leave it by itself at home, then you're going to get a lot of behavior issues, and actually the dog is going to likely to be really distressed. So those are the things we need to be thinking about. And when we're saying things like pets are wonderful and they saved me in the pandemic, we really need to think about the long-term implications and the animal welfare of the dogs as well, or the pets. Then a study around dementia therapy dog and how it helps with walking and with communicating. And this is certainly an area of research that has been explored a little bit, and there are certain benefits that we can see. But again, the research isn't clear on this, and we need to move away from articles and from kind of reading things and thinking, okay, one person says that one dog helps one other person. We really need the science behind it to know how effective is it long-term and on a larger scale. And particularly because there is some research to suggest that actually with people who have more severe dementia, when they interact with robot dogs, they're having the same benefits as a real dog. And if that's the case, then we need to be considering, do we really need to be having all therapy dogs visit everyone with dementia, or is it some people that they would help, and actually for other people we can actually use robot dogs? And this is something that I came across very recently, and actually it was something that kind of frustrated me a little bit. Adorable squirrel monkeys visit Lincoln care home residents. Now, this is really this is where it's kind of going off when we talk about animal assisted interventions. Often we think about horses and dogs, which can be trained, and they're domesticated animals, and horses obviously aren't, but they are kind of trained for riding, etc. When we then start thinking about wild animals and the fact that schools have snakes in them and they are their therapy animals, and now squirrel monkeys are visiting Lincoln, in this particular article, it says that the squirrel monkeys actually travelled from Oxfordshire to Lincolnshire, which is about a 2.5 to 3 hour journey. So we really need to be considering the animal welfare here, because these are wild animals. And actually, although the article says that everyone had a wonderful time, including the monkeys, the chances are people who actually made these sorts of comments don't really know enough about monkey behavior and monkey stress levels. And what we often don't do in animal assisted interventions is actually look at the animal themselves and how they are feeling within the intervention. So there has been some talk around maybe measuring dog cortisol levels to see whether dogs are getting stressed in certain interactions as well. But we really need to be very careful when we're talking about wild animals and including them in animal assisted interventions or any other visits. And this is an article that I came across which actually pretty much sums up all of the everything that I've said so far. So therapy animals are everywhere, but proof that they work actually isn't. And this is exactly the point. So we know there is some evidence to suggest that therapy animals work and that they have certain benefits on human well-being and on child development, etc. But actually, we don't know how much they help. We don't know what those mechanisms of change are and how they're improving the certain outcomes. And so we know very little about actually therapy animals. So what we really need to do is that we need to make sure that the science catches up before we go off and provide all of these interventions. So that's kind of giving you a picture of what the media says. And often the media wants to sell the stories, and we want positive stories, and particularly because we like animals, we want them to be beneficial, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with. But we really need to take a step back and think, first of all, why might animals be beneficial? And there are a number of theories, and I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I'm just going to give a brief overview of a few. So first of all, there's the attachment theory, and we tend to use this more with pets than therapy animals. But what this would suggest is that we are attached to our pets just like we get attached to humans, and actually that provides us with the security we need, and that kind of helps us in terms of our well-being and mental health. Although it has been shown that actually attachment to animals is different from attachment to humans. So we still have that level of attachment, and there are lots of measures that we can use to measure it. But actually, it's different because it's based around our care for the animal and how much time we spend with them, etc. And actually for children, again, we see that attachment, but it's related to the caring and friendships towards the pets, and how compassionate children are towards other animals. Whereas obviously we don't have that when we talk about attachment of human to human attachment. Then the idea of the social buffer or social support. So this goes back to the idea that animals are non-judgmental and they're there to support us, and they help us to enhance our mental health and well-being in that way, because they provide us with the comfort and the support that we need. And this is perhaps particularly important in situations where people are lonely and they don't have other humans around them for that social support, particularly in today's world where we live far away from family and friends. And so actually it's the idea that animals can fill that hole and that gap of supporting us. And then the final one is the biopsychosocial model, which is actually the one that I based my PhD on. It's a model that's been used for a long time in medical research, but actually only fairly recently, been adopted within animal-assisted interventions. And it's this idea that biological, social, and psychological factors really work together to underpin the effectiveness of animal-assisted interventions. And it's a complex web of what's being improved and how it's impacting on other things. But although it's a very good model in that you can include lots of different factors within it, again, the research is really lagging behind in terms of which factors are actually improved through AI and how do they impact on the other factors. So what does the research actually tell us? First of all, I'll start off with some research of animal-assisted interventions in education for autism. And my research is very much looking at special needs. So I didn't have any children who were within mainstream schools. So that's why I'll present the research which relates to special needs. And a lot of the research looks at autism. That may well have been because, first of all, autism is something that has gained a lot of research funding overall compared to some of the other conditions, but also it's quite a big spectrum, and so there are different areas that we want to be targeting, and it's making the sample sizes kind of more similar to each other. So a lot of people have looked at autism in particular, and we've had some really positive findings. So fewer repetitive behaviors and self-rating on fewer symptoms, and that's talking about autism symptoms, and that's after spending time with the dog in an intervention that actually compares dog and no dog conditions. Significantly more social initiation during social story teaching, again, when the dog was in the room compared to when the dog's not in the room. And again, this is this idea that the dogs can actually facilitate social interaction and social support. There were improvements in irritability, hyperactivity, social cognition, and communication. Now, this study actually looked at lots and lots of different outcomes, and those were the only ones that were significant. And this particularly looked at therapeutic horseback riding. And it's important to mention that actually when we're talking about animal-assisted interventions, one subgroup that is very well researched is horseback riding. So when we talk about equine interventions, actually we have a particular kind of length, which is usually 10 to 12 weeks, and the sessions are usually about an hour long. They are led by certified instructors, and actually they're very, very structured, and the outcomes are very clear. So the research is much better in that subgroup than compared to, say, dog research or research with other animals. So it's important to actually mention that, because that's the one area that has gone a little bit further when it comes to finding the benefits. There are also decreases in social withdrawal and increases in social skills. And this particular study actually looked at guinea pigs. And the guinea pigs were kind of available in the classroom for children. And the classrooms were mixed of children with autism and typically developing children. So it's interesting that actually different animals are also having an impact on social skills, and again, this idea of social support. But what we need to be careful is thinking about the animals that we're involving, because actually animals like guinea pigs and rabbits although they are, in inverted commas, easy to use within interventions, actually they're prey animals, and we need to be thinking about the well-being and the welfare of those animals rather than just thinking we should be just incorporating them within interventions because they may help. So there is lots of research on different areas of animal-assisted interventions, different types of animal-assisted interventions, and also on different outcomes for those with autism. So what we decided to do last year was actually look at conducting a meta-analysis. And the idea of this was just to pull all the information together and to be able to see what the outcomes actually are, particularly because so much of the research is so conflicting. So some research will find benefits on social interaction and some research won't. So we wanted to pull it together and to actually see whether there really is that improvement. And what we found was interesting. So first of all, there were very few studies with active control groups. In fact, there was just one. So when we were looking at randomized control trials, we were actually looking at a no treatment control group. So that, people were in one condition that did the animal assisted intervention, and another condition they just didn't do anything. And what we found that for social interaction and communication, there was indeed an improvement in animal assisted interventions compared to the no treatment control group. But those improvements were very small. So they were significant. So there was a difference between the two, but they were quite small improvements. Whereas when we looked at global autism symptoms, there were actually no improvements on the animal assisted intervention studies. Now, this was actually the only one that had an active control study in it. So it was where one group was doing the animal assisted intervention and another group was doing a dance activity. And actually what they found was that the dance activity was more beneficial on reducing global autism symptoms than the animal assisted intervention intervention. So that's really asking the question, should we include more active controls, more other activities that may benefit on these outcome measures, rather than just having a no active control group? Because it may well be that actually we just need to provide better interventions overall, and those don't necessarily need to involve animals within them. And that's not very clear at the moment. Another interesting finding that we had was that actually the relationship between dosage and effect size wasn't significant. So when we were looking at what we expected to see was the more or the higher the dosage of the intervention, so the overall total number of minutes would actually result in higher effect size. So the intervention will be more effective if the dosage is higher. But that relationship wasn't actually significant. The direction was in the way that we would expect it, but it wasn't significant. And so what we would really want is to have more studies, because we were on the verge of the minimum number of studies that we could run this for. We want more studies, and we actually want to know whether there is a cutoff of the effectiveness of the dosage. Are there a certain number of sessions, a certain number of minutes before these interventions actually become effective? So some of the research around other diagnoses then, when research looked at severe learning difficulties, actually they found that there were improved attitudes towards school. So in this instance, there was actually an improved responsibility, respect, and empathy for children who spent time with the dog. But we need to be careful, because this study is actually just a case study design. So actually it's not very replicable. Having said that, there aren't many studies that look at severe learning difficulties. So really that's something that we need to be working more on, and doing it in a safe way for the dogs as well, or for the animals that are being included. Interestingly, boys with insecure and disorganized attachment actually showed lower levels of cortisol when spending time with a therapy dog during a stress test, which was a standardized test that they completed. And that was in comparison with 2 other conditions. So they were looking at a group of children doing the same task with a stuffed toy animal, and then a group with a friendly human as well. And actually the only group that had lower levels of cortisol, so that's an indication of stress, were actually the children with the real dog. So it's suggesting that the therapy dog does do something different in that context and for those children. But again, we need to think of how does that actually relate to stress test scores or to other kind of outcome measures within everyday life. Children with Down syndrome actually improved their gross motor skills during an equine-assisted intervention, and that's not surprising. So as I've mentioned already, equine interventions are more kind of researched, and we know more about them, and they're more structured. But also, because we have kind of horseback riding, and we also have horsemanship, which is doing physical activities, we would therefore expect that there is an improvement in gross motor skills, because those are the skills that children are using during those interventions. So I've presented some of the research so far, and now I want to go through some of the limitations which I have tried to overcome with my PhD research. And it's not just from the research that I've presented, but generally from the field. First of all, a lot of the studies are quite small scale. This isn't surprising because, first of all, the research is developmental. Secondly, it's experimental often. And thirdly, it often includes, well, it's with children with special needs. So actually, it's a very difficult population to get a large sample size for. So that's why it's perhaps important to actually have more meta-analysis in the field, if that's possible, which it isn't always because of the measures that are being used. But if there are a number of measures, the same measures being used, then a number of meta-analyses can be run. Overstating effectiveness of findings. You will often find academic journals that start off with something like benefits of animal-assisted interventions are widely accepted, and then they would give lots of references, but actually the other side of the argument isn't presented. So what about the studies that didn't find these differences? When we talk about children with special needs, often the research includes children above a certain IQ score. So actually the research isn't inclusive. And this is really problematic because if you think about it, children with special needs who work very closely academically to their typically developing peers are likely to have less of an increase in ability from any intervention, because they're probably already working close to an optimum level. Whereas if we're talking about the children that are really struggling academically, and we provide different interventions, be it animal-assisted interventions or other ones, we're more likely to see an improvement in their achievements. There is a huge lack of randomized controlled trial designs. So often there are no control groups as well. So we really need to be thinking about the kind of the studies and the design of the studies before we start doing it. Now, sometimes it's difficult within schools to do randomized controlled trial designs, but there are lots of ways to overcome that. So things like waitlist control designs are still better, or if you do a randomized controlled trial design, just make sure that the children that were in the control groups actually get to spend time with the animals after that. Of course, that takes more time. That can take more money as well, depending on whether you're costing in kind of the visits from the therapy dogs. But it's important that we actually think about a rigorous design before we even start. If they're a control group, often children aren't in the same class or school. Again, that comes from the setting, and it just needs a lot of extra consideration, really. There is very little longitudinal data. So often we would have a measure before the intervention and after the intervention, and often we'll see improvements in some of the studies. But actually, we don't know if these improvements last long term. And if they don't, then it's not really feasible to have therapy dogs or other animals in the classroom 24/7. And also the question is, at what point will that no longer be effective? So for any intervention, really what we need to be seeing immediate effects, but then we also need to be seeing longer term effects as well. The intervention setup is very unclear, apart from equine-assisted intervention, which is often very clear. Actually, when we talk about dogs, it more often than not tends to not be specified at all, or it tends to be quite unstructured. So children just spend a certain amount of time with the dogs. There is also the possibility of novelty effects. So if we're bringing an animal into a classroom, most children love animals, and so there may well be improvement in behaviour or in other social skills just because of the novelty of the animal being there, rather than because there is an impact of the animal themselves. Or at the very least, we could see an improvement in the effect of the animal being there because of novelty. So that we really need to think about how do we overcome that. And there is lots of lack of physiological data. So physiological data like heart rate or cortisol. So we really don't know, if we're thinking of the biopsychosocial model, we don't really know that biological kind of factor within the three. So the design of my PhD research then. First of all, I sent off some parent questionnaires. So I asked for pet ownership. They also completed the EQSQ, which is looking at empathy and systemizing within children, and that's particularly known to be different for children with autism. So they tend to score higher on the systemizing than the empathizing. And I also asked for socioeconomic status within that as well. Then I measured cortisol for children. So I measured a baseline cortisol, so on 3 consecutive days, roughly at the same time, and very clear protocols were followed around that. Then teachers also completed questionnaires relating to behaviour at school. So every teacher that had children from their class participating were asked to actually complete an individual questionnaire for each child. Then we had baseline in-person testing. So I tested language, both comprehension and syntactic formulation. I also assessed 4 different cognitive tasks, including nonverbal reasoning and problem solving. Again, those were using standardized measures. Children completed anxiety and self-esteem questionnaires as well, and they took part in some experimental tasks. So they did a categorization task, because we know from the literature that that can impact language, but also some children with autism tend to have different different levels of categorization, different ability to categorize things. Then children were separated into different intervention and control groups. So I had a no treatment control group. Then there were 2 dog intervention groups. One was an individual, so one-to-one child, dog and handler. And the other one was a group intervention. So up to 8 children in a group with 1 dog and 1 handler. And I also had an active control, which was a relaxation intervention. And again, some of the children were doing it as a one-to-one, and then some of them were doing it as a group intervention. Once those 4 weeks were done, and within those 4 weeks, each child saw that was in the intervention groups took part for 2 times 20 minutes a week. Once that was over, I measured baseline cortisol again, same time as the initial measure, and again 3 consecutive days. And then after the intervention, the same baseline testing was conducted. So the language, the cognitive tasks, the self-esteem and the anxiety. Parents and teachers were again asked to complete the questionnaires, obviously not the socioeconomic status or the pet ownership, because that wouldn't change, but any questionnaires that could have changed over the duration of the intervention. And then lastly, the in-person testing was done again longitudinally, 6 weeks, 6 months, and 1 year after the intervention finished. And obviously in that time, none of the children saw any of the dogs or did any of the relaxation. So some of the key findings, I'll start off with some of the language findings. And again, there were lots and lots of findings, but I've kind of just pulled out a few different ones. So all children improved over time on comprehension. And it's important to say here that the children that took part are actually separated into high ability and low ability. Now, the reason for that is basically the tasks that they were able to complete. So children could only completing the tasks that they were able to. They obviously weren't made to complete any tasks that were too different. And because their abilities were huge, I had no restriction as to who could take part. Actually, some children could only complete some of the kind of easier tasks. And that led to kind of this division, because the tasks were different. Some children were classed as high ability and some as low ability. So when we talk about high ability children, there was an interaction between time and condition, but actually the post hoc test didn't show a significant difference. And when I looked at the means, or if I did a paired samples t-test, then I could see that actually the biggest improvement wasn't often in the dog group, but that wasn't statistically significant from the other groups. So we do need to be very cautious with that. It was the same for the low ability children when it came to the comprehension. But actually, when we looked at the syntactic formulation, interestingly, the control children, so those that weren't doing anything, they just completed the task twice before and after the intervention, actually they were the ones that showed a significant improvement over time, rather than any of the other intervention groups. Moving on to categorization, so within the categorization, children basically had to categorize items into ocean or farm, and half of the items were animate, half of them were inanimate, half of them were typical, and half of them were atypical. And as we would expect, animate items were categorized quicker and typical items were categorized quicker. But we didn't have any intervention effects at all. Now, what was interesting here is actually the pattern of categorization is similar to typically developing children. But what we need to do is we need to actually compare how quickly children were categorizing items, because we do it's a reaction times measure. So that would be really interesting to see, because at that point we can actually make a better judgment around categorization and how does that impact potentially on language development. Moving on to the cognitive findings, again, separated into high and low ability. And again, there were improvements over time. Now, when we talk about the children in the low ability, those children only took part in the individual intervention for safety reasons. So in terms of the group intervention, this was set up as up to about 8 children with myself and a dog handler and a dog. Now, children of low ability didn't have the same level of understanding, and so we needed to make sure that everyone, including the dog and the handler, was safe, and that we didn't have any tantrums. And that would have related in every child having a one-to-one, which wasn't possible within the school day. So that's why in the low ability, there were only individual interventions taking part. But all children, again, improved over time on some of the measures. And we did actually see a difference, particularly with the picture similarity. So that's another one of the tasks. So that was a task where they had different pictures and they had to match the picture, and they kind of had to problem solve within that. And actually, there were benefits for the dog intervention after for the children that had spent time with the dogs. Then we come to the physiological and behavior measures. So self-esteem didn't show any significant effects. We did have some trends when we looked at dog ownership, but there weren't enough children to kind of within that group to be able to actually do proper analysis on it. So perhaps self-esteem may be impacted by an animal-assisted intervention, but that might depend on whether the children have a pet at home or not. When we looked at anxiety actually came down over time for all children. And that could well be because they're more used to me when they're answering questions, and they feel more relaxed and less anxious over time. So that, again, we had no effects of animal-assisted interventions in there. When we looked at the teacher report, so that was looking at the behavior. So it was a questionnaire looking at the behavior of children within the classroom. Actually, it was interesting because the relaxation group showed a significant improvement before to after intervention compared to the other groups. But when we looked at the dog group just before and after, they also showed an improvement in their behaviors. And there weren't any differences in the empathizing and systemizing as a result of the interventions. But again, there were some interesting trends around dog ownership. But again, we didn't have enough data on that to be able to analyze it. And now moving on to the cortisol. So it's important to point out that children with special needs don't necessarily have higher or lower levels of cortisol, but their pattern is different. So what we would always expect is that we have a diurnal pattern of cortisol, everyone does. We have a peak at the start of the day, and then that quickly decreases, and that decreases over time, and we've got our lowest levels of cortisol before we go to sleep. But this kind of pattern isn't seen in all children with special needs. So actually, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, are we able to change the levels of cortisol from the interventions? And it's important here actually to point out that this study was run in parallel to another study, which is exactly the same, but run in mainstream schools. So what we were able to do is actually compare the data from the two studies and look at the levels of cortisol and compare how the levels of cortisol of those with special needs was compared to mainstream children. The cortisol was only measured before and after intervention for cost reasons. It's quite expensive. But I did follow a very strict protocol. So children were just asked to spit into a tube, but there was no eating, exercise, or brushing of teeth 30 minutes before the cortisol collection. And the samples were taken on 3 consecutive school days, roughly at the same time of day, because as you can see from the graph, the levels of cortisol differ over the day. And so I had some really interesting findings, and essentially those were that the children in the dog group intervention, so those ones that were taking part in the dog group as part of a group of children, actually showed a significant decrease in cortisol. And those in the relaxation individual condition actually increased their levels of cortisol. So it would suggest here that taking part in an animal-assisted intervention as part of a group for children with special needs actually reduces their levels of cortisol over a 4-week period. And that's really interesting, because when we did the comparison between mainstream and special needs children, we saw that the children with special needs had significantly higher levels of cortisol compared to the children who were in mainstream schools at the start of term. And actually by the end of term, by the end of the intervention, for the dog group intervention, that difference was no longer significant. So it's suggesting that taking part as a group actually reduces the levels of stress. And that's really interesting, because then we need to think about the interaction between, say, social support from peers as well as the dog, because we are not seeing the same trend or the same impact of the individual dog group as well. So what are the conclusions that we can take away from this? There seems to be some beneficial effects of the cortisol findings, and actually that's really promising, because the idea that we might be able to reduce stress levels of children, that might actually help us to teach them better in the long run. More specific and targeted interventions are actually required, and this is really because we want to know who benefits most from these sorts of interventions. And we really need to be establishing these mechanisms of change. What is it that we're changing within specific populations that then impacts on other areas? There is a need to have appropriate control groups, and this really needs to be thought out very carefully, because if we think about some of the control groups, like using a stuffed animal instead of using a real animal, the interaction isn't the same. So it's not really comparable. And the whole idea around an active control is actually that we have really comparable interventions. Animal welfare and well-being should always come first. And unfortunately at the moment, it's not. And unfortunately at the moment, it's becoming a very big business. So a lot of money is involved, and often the animal welfare is kind of lagging behind, whereas that should be the most important thing that we think about. We need to have thorough procedures, protocols, and risk assessments in place to keep the children and people safe that take part in animal-assisted interventions, but also to keep the animals safe. We don't want to be putting animals in situations of stress and pressure, because that's just going to result in them being unhappy, and then they can react. And the way that animals communicate, they can't speak, so they're going to act, and that can cause physical damage, but also it will then result in the animal obviously being classed as not being suitable, or worse, being put to sleep because of it, when actually it was us that have put that animal in that situation in the first place. And I always kind of finish with a slide just thanking all the volunteers that took part and all of the wonderful dogs, and the 2 charities that I worked with, who were Therapy Dogs Nationwide and Pets as Therapy. And the research was funded by Mars Waltham who fund research into human-animal interactions. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions,